have, let's say, 1.5 hours, because we might need 15 minutes between this session and then the public lecture or the public panel and 6:30. So, did you give your assessment or your evaluation? You didn't?
I didn't get an assessment. I don't know if everyone did.
Sorry?
All right.
You evaluate. The public is this evening. Okay. So it means that what you are saying is that you are going to give it after the... Okay. You have somebody at the door waiting for you and getting the... No, we need that, really. I'm serious about that. And then we also are preparing something which is a kind of a certificate of attendance for you that we give you this depending on the evaluation. Business is not, okay, business exactly, business is business, you know how it works. So no forms, no certificate. That's as simple as that. So the people are coming through the side. Sorry? Sorry? We still need a few copies of those. So now you ask because you know the certificate. Got you. So you need to find Tanya will give you it. Okay. That's good. Floor is open. I think that we will just take maybe 3 to 5 questions and then answer them instead of having just one.
Can I say something? Sorry. Just wanted to say something. And that is the power.
I'm worried. What are you going to say?
Don't worry. You know, sometimes people ask us, okay, what is the relationship between critical Muslim studies and the CILE? And I'm saying, and I always insist, that there is a lot of common things. We are interested in what CILE is doing, okay? And we have a strong interest in that, this kind of conversations. And there is vice versa also an interest in the kind of questions we raise in critical Muslim studies. So we've been working with Tariq over several years now, and we have a lot of respect among ourselves, despite the difference you might see, you know, emphasis, etc. There is a lot of respect here that we have towards the work that Tariq is doing and the team is doing. And I want to just clarify that from the beginning, just to put that there, you know, because we share a lot of issues. I can make a laundry list, okay, that I don't want to spend more time. It's a laundry list of topics that we share, okay? And within that, then we have disagreement, we have differences, etc. But the most important thing is dignity. We respect dignity. We respect whatever difference we have. We know that we are, now is the football World Cup. We are like, knocking, you know, how do you say, kicking the ball towards the same place.
Depending on the team you are supporting.
Anyway, this is the spirit, and I just want to keep this as the spirit for the conversation we're having now. Okay?
Thank you. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So if she's helping you to ask the question, that's fine.
First of all, I was thank you
You have to raise your voice because you need also to talk to the people over there.
So I have actually 2 questions, 2 big questions. Since I'm here in Granada, I arrived like 3 years ago, and when we are talking with others, I feel like the real Ummah, everyone is from everywhere, people from Russia, from Kazakhstan, from Canada, from everywhere. So I really feel like the Ummah, and that's the Renewal feeling. The thing is that it's not utopia, and even if we feel like the Ummah, the situation of Muslims in the world are not like we are today, like sharing the same principles and everything. Especially when you compare that the beginning of Islam began with 70 people who are moving from Mecca to Medina, and now we are more than 1 billion, and it's not comparable. So now we are facing many challenges: lack of women scholars, like you talked yesterday, lack of research and interest in bioethics, like Dr. Ghaly said yesterday too. There's a gap between academic research and the rest of Muslim people. We're talking about lack of normative political structure, lack of environmental engagement, and and I want to talk about solutions. We know that we have problems. What are the solutions? I know it's a very big topic, a very big debate. And I reread the topic, the title of our summer school, and it's huge: Islamic critical thinking, ethics, and sensitive contemporary issues. So my point is, you were talking also yesterday about 3 things in Islam: the past, our mission, and we have to work with partners, coexistence in the world to make the world a better place. And I'm an entrepreneur, and I need to have a pragmatic, pragmatism actually. So I'm working on how I used to become future leaders in politics, economics, environment, and everything. So that's my mission. I know that I want to die for it. And the thing is that I want to leave the summer school not with just being happy of, like, I spent 1 week with the Shuyukh and Tariq Ramadan, or like just my have good conscience.
He's Sheikh.
I'm from France, and Tariq Ramadan is like start from. But I'm trying to purify the intention too. So I want to leave, and I try to understand what you want to leave. Comment vous voulez avec quoi on part? That's not. I don't want to just go with souvenirs and people I met or conferences I attended to. We are leaving on Saturday, some of us, and we are going back to our lives. And you have CILE has a very important, have an international network of Muslims, new generation, and I'm convinced in every cell in myself that we are going to change the world in a better place and make it a better place. So I think that my point is like, we have so many challenges. What is the strategy we can put together to change really things like in politics, environment, economics, and to become a real economic hub? To have the Islamic, to get the potential of Islam. So it's a big question. And okay, that's question.
This is the question.
Yeah. And the other question. So I'm stopping here. The second question is I was talking about with Ramon on the 5 minutes lunch. And I know about Granada's Muslim community here, and they set up a real system, economic system with their own money, Islamic money, and trade and transactions. So what do you think about it? And because I know that it's coming to France, I know the person who is doing the movement to France. So yeah, what I'm thinking about it, and it's dangerous or not.
Dangerous.
Is it dangerous?
Is it better? Okay. Okay, that's fine. We will take you to very, very big questions, but we try still for all the other questions because we are organizing our days by topics. So today it's politics and what we had this morning. So it's an open discussion, but still we try to focus on the topic on politics that we have, even though with what your first big question you can relate to politics in one way and another on practical solutions. So the second question, yeah.
My question is about Muslims in the West. This morning it's been mentioned several times, explicitly or implicitly, that there should be a more elaborated Muslim voice when it comes to new economic models, more democracy, human rights. And I know, Professor Ramon, for example, that you're constantly insisting in your lectures that the contribution of Muslims to the public debate should not be limited to Muslim issues, but also to all issues that concern society. My question is the following. When it comes to institutionalizing this Muslim voice and this Muslim contribution, what do you think is the more appropriate? Do you think we should have Muslim organizations talking about economy and acting in economy, same thing for politics, same thing for social justice, human rights? Or do you think that Muslims as individuals can and should join any organization that is being developed or already developed in the field, as long as it's not contradictory with our key fundamental principles?
Thank you.
Question to
It's coming.
No,
Take it easy.
I didn't say anything. I thought you were looking for the third person because you counted me as number 3.
You are fine. You are fine. Ask the
Counted me
question.
as 5. Okay.
So you will be the pro. That's okay.
No, it's fine.
It's fine?
Yeah.
So Dr. El-Shinqiti, first of all, when you presented 11 principles of values of Islamic political system, authentic Islamic political system, I was a little bit confused because after listing all of them, then you mentioned the historical precedent of one of Muslim scholars who in the past then spoke like in contradiction to some of these values, like women, poor people, and finally nobody has right to vote. Does it mean that these 11 values, or some of them, went through reinterpretation? And the second part of the question, how do you estimate the possibility of using these values in the modern world to construct the modern, authentic, political Islamic democracy political system?
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Hatem, for your presentation this morning. I found it really, really refreshing, and also it touched on a lot of things that I'm really passionate about. I wanted to ask a question, but I would like to illustrate it with a few points. So, firstly, one of the things that you'd said was that some Muslims disengage with the environment through using the excuse that our Prophet ﷺ was an environmentalist and that's enough. But actually I think that what we do as Muslims is far worse. What we do is we engage with the environment on a very superficial way. So we think we're doing environmental good, but actually we don't look at compliance, we don't look at how we're contributing to propagating harm. So, for example, I'm going to give you 2 examples of that. In the UK, we have Islamic organizations that are environmental, and they've set up food banks. And food banks are great for immediate interventions. However, they're not looking at democratizing food systems, they're not looking at food transparency or even consumption. So the way that they're operating is like a positive duty of assistance, almost like international aid equipped with good intention. And then the second thing, I'm so glad that you talked about distribution and resource, because one of the ways that we can, I hope, address this issue of how we're engaging with the environment is through environmental justice and environmental racism. And this is how we should be talking about it, but we're not. We don't seem to recognize that environmental destruction is part of extension of colonialism and the legacies of colonialism. So what is being done, the types of destruction that's being done, is being done to the global south specifically through certain corporations that are the same entities of imperialism, and what the impact of that is having particularly on women and how they're being brought into a centralized economic system. So again, it is about distribution and talking about it in terms of resource justice and resource theft, and we see that all the time. So I guess my question is situated within a wider problem of brand Islam and working through our problems in an almost capitalist, imperialist way without looking at our own complicity. And I wondered what kind of solutions you would advocate or strategies you'd advocate so that we can start really reimagining alternatives that are far more powerful and actually aligned to Islam.
Okay, there was the last one. Oh, yes, that's you.
Yeah, it's me. I was trying to hide, but it's okay.
She pushed you, so that's the right way of doing
Well,
it.
that's why I'm asking my question in public. I wanted to ask it in private, to be honest, but the ladies I was having lunch with, they told me to ask it in public. My question is...
It's a double push.
So my question is to you, Dr. Tariq, and it's more spiritual. You mentioned a very profound statement while you were doing your talk. You said that حب الدنيا وكراهية الموت. My question is, I'm sure we're all attached to this life in one way or another, and that's, to me, in my opinion, is the root of many of our problems, our fears, our lack of courage, our fear of losing our jobs, and many things that are putting us in the position we are today. So I want to know your opinion on how can we free ourselves from the attachment to this world in order to be more empowered and make a difference in this life. So my question is that simple, but I'm not sure if the answer is that simple. Thank you so much.
Do you think that this question is simple? Okay.
It's short. It's short.
Let me know about your complex questions.
Thank
Okay,
you.
Dr. Shafiq. Yes.
Did the Islamic political values were they interpreted in the past in a way that broke what we call the Islamic synthesis? Yes, and unfortunately, Muslims adopted in the past specifically with the two challenges that I said the Islamic principles were facing. One of them is the Arabian anarchism, and one of them is the mostly Persian monarchism. And you cannot have a free state based on the rule of law in a situation of anarchism or monarchism. You have to find a way in between. What happened is the first experience, which is the closest to the Islamic ideals, Khilafah al-Rashida, was destroyed by these two factors. This anarchism inside, which led to the murder of 3 of these 4 killers, and the monarchism from outside, when the governor of Syria, who Muawiyah, as Mohammed talked about, and he, in a sense, adopted the Byzantine way of political life and brought this monarchism to the Arabia and to the Islamic world in general at that time. And then when Muslim scholars started to try to theorize the situation, the monarchy has been a long time established, accepted by people. And what happened, it was just some sort of adaptation with this situation. And therefore, they reinterpreted those values in a way that legitimized monarchism. Therefore, what we need today in the Islamic culture is a new reinterpretation of these principles. There is always interaction between revelation and the daily life of people, revelation and the culture of people, and these kind of interaction lead to some sort of mutual adjustment. So sometimes the religious text is interpreted in a way that serve some goals that are not religious, but also people's life is adjusted according to the religious principle. This is the lesson of history of religion in general. And I think we have to have a new interpretation of these values, and what we were trying today is just to present these values in new light, what we believe is closer to the spirit of Islam, and make them more relevant to the contemporary world. What is the second question? Yeah, I have a remark actually. It's not a question, but it's a remark on something that has been said just today and yesterday by Dr. Tariq, and also by one of these speakers yesterday about the book of Halak, The Impossible State. And this is something I wanted to say today, but I was just talking too long. I think, yeah, the Islamic State, as seen by some Islamists, might be impossible state, as Halak said, but I think also a secular state is impossible, same situation. So we need to find something different. And the conclusion of my presentation today that I did not come to is that at the end, we will end with a synthesis that Islamists will see as Islamic and secularists will see as secular. And this is actually not strange in the Islamic context, because Islam is not purely religion in the common meaning of this sense. It's more than that, as we said, and therefore maybe one of the Egyptian philosophers, scholars today, who probably you know him, Hassan Hanafi, said one time, maybe he went too far, but he said that Islam is a secular religion. So if there is a secular religion, if that term is possible, Islam is really, I don't say it's secular religion, but I said it's not purely religious. And Ali Asad Begovic, in his very extraordinary, insightful book, Islam Between East and West, explained his idea clearly. And I remember one of his saying in the book, he said, you cannot change the world by rejecting it, by accepting it. So Muslims can change the world only by accepting it. And as I said also that in order for religion to impact the world, it has to be worldly. So I think we are heading towards some kind of historic compromise between Islamists and secularists, and they will have some kind of common ground that Islamists see as Islamic and secularists see as secular.
So there were a number of questions. One, the feeling about the real ummah. It's part is a challenge of bringing Muslims from different walks of life, and different experiences, in a setting where you're dealing with the complexities of the problems that we're all facing. So in the one sense, there is a feeling of community, and that's very important for us to have that feeling. However, in terms of the gap between academic scholarship and others, that's one of the real challenges, where our ability to develop more of literacy among Muslims to a higher level. One of the calamities that I see is that Muslims as a category are no longer as almost appetitive for knowledge as possibly or earlier historical periods. And for me, I'll often start with that the first revelations that we received was actually a command to read. which means that our tradition has been vested in reading and scholarship in education. And unfortunately, these days, we don't read, and that which we read, we don't understand. And that's a real sense. And even when we read, we only select those readings that agree with our point of view, and therefore we're not expanding our perspective. So there has to be a systematic way for us to engage. Another part of me often encourages during the month of Ramadan, aside from this, is actually, instead of making competitions on one thing or the other, actually make competition on book reading. And in 30 days, how many, let's say, in each community, how many of our young youth can read how many books outside of the norm in general. So that's a part of how we could begin to close the gap. Also encourage book reading clubs for Muslim institutions, where you actually select a number of books that people read on a monthly basis to engage and discuss. So that's all some of the initiatives that can begin to close some of the gap on a real sense. Now, this space in us is for us to think about some of the issues in a broad, you could say, academic way. And I'm hesitant to say, here's what your marching order needs to be, because each context is different. And if you think also in terms of Imam Bukhari, he says, Bab al-ilm qabla al-amal, the chapter of knowledge before action. And therefore, I'm thinking that we are in this space to take that Bab al-ilm, and in order for us to go back with some aspect of a worldview to get us inspired to do some of the work with that knowledge in our background. The question about the Granada currency as a counter model for economic engagement, I will still be hesitant. It comes from a particular type of understanding and a particular type of response. And I think there has to be some more engagement and understanding of what that means, and not as a way of trying to think of the past as far as gold and silver as currency and immediately say that this is the response. That only deals with one issue in a very complex economic issues that we're dealing with. So it's a very problematic at this point without all the ingredients that are in place. So that's at least on the issue of the currencies. Muslims living in the West, when I called for us to participate, I did not mean for us to leave our Muslim point of view. What I said is that we need to come to the table with others, but have our Muslim Muslim identity, but not in a problematic way, actually expressed. For example, in the United States, I created the American Muslims for Palestine. Because for me, there were 70 different groups that are working for Palestine, but none of them had the Muslim identity on it. And therefore, I did not want to come to a space to speak about Palestine where the Muslim is not part of the equation. And people said, you already have two strikes against you, Muslim and Palestine. What else that you need? Right? I said, no, that's where actually I begin the conversation, because I need to be at the table and I need to assert my Muslim point of view in the discussion on Palestine. So in thinking about coalitions, is that which community you bring to the table. So I'm always a person that wants communities to be there, not only leaders. And that involves, in general, broadly speaking, about the type of political commitments that we make. It's a community engagement, and you need to bring the community with you and engage as such with a broader coalition and offering your Muslim perspective. Sometimes it's going to be taken, sometimes it's going to be problematic, sometimes you're going to be what you call thrown out of the meeting because you're just, but that's part of the fight that you need to be engaged with others. And people have to see that you're an added value to the problems that confronting all of us. So the Muslims in the West has to be a person that is actually ready to be engaged without leaving their own organization or their own commitment. Now, individually, I'm able to align myself with a variety of different coalitions that sometimes the community might not be there. Right? And we have to be honest to speak to the community before we make those alliances, because what often happens is we speak ill of the community as a way to assert our progressiveness. For me, that is actually not a sign of progressiveness, that's a sign of not being honest and rooted in a community that essentially will embrace you, whether you are falling or you're moving forward. So I often say, even if I'm going individually in, I need to inform the people which I believe to have my back in a structural way. So those have to be discussed and have to be articulated, and I think we have a broader arena for us to engage as Muslims in the West. What I don't like is Muslims in the West to construct that you look at the world through a hole that you open in your door, and that's the only part of the world that you see. The world is much broader than that hole that you open, and I think a large number of Muslims do operate with that lens. Sometimes it's out of fear, sometimes of not wanting to be out there engaged. So there has to be some discussions of how we could move ourselves forward in a much more complex way. The one about the environment, and I think I need to explain what I said about using the Prophet Muhammad, using that banner, the Prophet Muhammad is the first environmentalist. What I feel is that Muslims use that banner or that quote essentially to absolve themselves of taking responsibility of their specific actions relative to environmental destruction, overconsumption, economic disorientation. So all of a sudden you speak to them and say, well, I follow the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and he's the first environmentalist. And say, alhamdulillah, so at least we get the principle, so let's move to the next level. And once you move to the next level, there's a lack of engagement and a lack of commitment to the environment. As for example, in Berkeley, we had a group of hippies who went up to on the trees for 2.5 years. And people were laughing at them, and for me that was not a laughing matter, because it takes a tremendous commitment for somebody to actually climb up the tree and be in the tree for 2.5 years because they want to protest a project of building a football stadium, renovating a football stadium for $430 million, and in the process they're going to cut the tree to play 8 games a year. Right? $430 million to build a stadium to play 8 games a year, and they could just move down the street about 15 miles. There's a big stadium that's already there, owned by the city of Oakland, right? And you could actually do the same thing. So for me, these individuals that were up there have expressed a commitment. Some parts of the community were laughing at them, and here they did not want to create the understanding of what is taking place and begin to critique the structure that favors gladiators over education, over diversity, over economic vitality and viability. So Muslims have essentially used these statements that often are just banner statements that are not articulated in a systematic critique and a systematic engagements. And you could see it in other locations as well, in the US and other places. So for me, the silence is no longer acceptable. Silence in terms of what is taking place in Muslim majority countries, but also Muslim minorities in the West who tend to replicate because they think that they made it right, into the country club up in the West. They mostly are in middle class to upper middle class status in many places, just leaving African American Muslims in the US and possibly some other areas. So in essence, they're aspiring to be part of the destructive behavior rather than part of the change that needs to be undertaken. The question about how to get the love of the world and detachment, that's something that we have to have a whole class about. Right? Die before you die. Right? Take yourself to account before you take yourself into account. How to go through a process of annihilating that inner self that is within you that always want to be out there. So we have a whole methodology of tazkiyah, purification of the heart. It's a method that is systematic, that requires discipline and requires engagement. And fortunately, once again, because of the variety of tensions that are present in the Muslim world, that aspect of Islam tend to be left to the side or not as well systematically engaged with, and that leaves us running in almost a shortened approach toward Islam in general. But I think it's correct that we have to be in the world, but the world is not to be in our hearts. And today the world is in our heart, and we want to compete, right, to be seen as the successful part of the world, because the world is in our heart, and therefore the one who pursues the world will never be given to them. But you leave the world behind you, it will be given to you as a bonus. So let's work for the bonus rather than work for that which we can't attain.
Thank you. Just, I had 3 questions, and just preliminary remarks about what was said by Ramon, and also just because these were not questions, but I think that as it is the last moment we are together, this will be the last thing. Tomorrow we are starting to have our 2 parallel things. We discussed about this yesterday, and it's true that in fact it would have been very important for you to understand the very essence of our working together. So because some people have been here for 1 week already, some are just arriving on Monday, or just put together, and we are coming with a vision from CILE. CILE has a vision, it's quite clear, and this is why we started with an introduction to CILE. And while the critical thinking is part of our methodology, so we are sharing the critical thinking, not always all the conclusions or all the answers. I don't know if even there is an answer in critical Muslim studies. One answer, I don't see it. I think that we have many partners, and what I saw last year was even contradictory trends, but that's not a problem within the whole philosophy of critical Muslim studies. So, in fact, it's questioning and trying to share something which is beyond only reading the scriptural source in a critical way, but understanding the complexity of the world and coming with alternatives. So this is what we are sharing first, beyond the fact that, as it was said, we respect each other, and this is why we thought it was, when I came here last year, I thought and we discussed that the fact to have also CILE in the process was important, and this is why we will also wanted to have 2 days together, and then the rest of it will be also something which is, it's not different, but at least we had something which is connected to our vision. The second thing is about why Allah. I don't want to be misunderstood on this. I don't agree with everything he was saying, but one of the main questions that he's asking, it's important, and I think that the contemporary Islamist thought or trends should really look at the nation state as a question in itself. Very often the question, the legal on the Islamic reference, but not the state in the way it is now. So this is why I think that in the discussion that I had with many people are involved in trying to change the society, and even when they speak about the civil state, the problem is not if it's Islamic or civil, the problem is the state and the way you perceive it, and the legal and the structure. This is what I was sharing. I think he's right now. On many other things that he's saying, even about Sharia and things, I still have some critical position on that. So as to the first question, what you were, once again, when you were, I understand that you can come for summer school and say we will have some solutions about some of the questions that we have. It's not the way we were putting summer school for us. I think that mainly is to question the mindset, to question the way we ask the questions, the way we put the questions, the way we understand the problems. Now, it's not from here that you are going back home and say, okay, if you have the feeling that this is like the only that's very good, take this, that's deep, okay? Now, as to the intellectual input is much more the way we put the questions than the way we are going to give you solutions. Because even in many of the fields, for example, what I wanted to do this morning is exactly where I am with my questions. Because this is where I am. It's not even that I'm not sure that I have answers. I know that on some of the questions that I asked this morning, I don't have the answer. So I am not going to give you an answer I don't have. But
question as enough.
Sorry?
It's like staying in the questioning enough.
No, it's not celebrating questions for the sake of questions. Here's
some of the answers we may have, some others we don't, and in some fields we are just trying to come with a methodology. So for me, what is important is the vision, is do we agree or not on understanding Islam as a message that is telling you deep down in your heart as much as in your mind you are here to change the world, and then you have to put the question in that way. So this is part of the solution. And part of the problem with the Muslims today is the way they put the questions. It's not only the way they answer. So I would say this. So it's more, I would say it's more humble as to the solution and more ambitious as to the project. I don't know if you understand what I mean. But this is exactly it. This is the way I would put it. So about what you were asking, I think it's you. And I think that I agree with Dr. Hatem about when we are talking about Muslims in the West and Muslim voices in politics and economies. I wrote a book that was completely neglected by Muslims, which is the Quest for me. And this is one of the books I prefer. And in fact, the starting point of this is exactly what was said. Get out of your window. Get out of your window. Start the journey. Which, in fact, for me, the spiritual life is a journey. Because the word in the heart is taqwa. So this is it. It's this pilgrimage, the whole essence of it. This is the way I look at life. And this has a consequence on all the questions that I have today. Having said that, now, when we get out of your window, doesn't mean that you don't have a viewpoint, but you have to take your viewpoint everywhere in all the fields in the way it was put by Dr. Hatem, and on this I agree, but we have to be involved in politics, we have to be involved in economy, but it's what I call the added value. The added value is, once again, sometimes it's not by the way the answers that we put, it's the way we put the questions in the West, in politics, for example, in the way we deal with politics. Because we are in great danger when it comes to settling down, being part of the Western life. As you know, you have two ways of putting it. Normalize your presence without realizing it, or normalize your presence and be invisible. Invisible means it's not integration, it's complete alienation, assimilation, and you are not visible. You are not, and I'm not talking about the visible signs, meaning, you know, the way you dress. It's really the added, I'm talking about ethical distinctiveness. It's the way you are breathing this, in the way you are, for example, able to come with very deep questions in the field of sciences. If we are serious about transdisciplinary, for example, in environment, when I wrote the book Radical Reform, I made it clear I'm not going to talk about economy without talking about environment. I'm not going to talk about environment without talking about economy. It's the same. If you don't understand that this is connected from the beginning. So this transdisciplinary approach in ethical terms, this is what we have to bring. But if you look at the people in the West, the people who are at the forefront of these issues, they would say, yes, fragmentation of knowledge was the reason why we are so in advance and so lost. Because fragmentation of knowledge in itself is the problem. And I see Muslims now getting this, and when you look at them, they have exactly the same tendency to be fragmented in the way they are dealing with this. So they are dealing with politics, dealing with economy. They might have very radical stances on how we reject the system, but if you look at the way they are putting the question, it's exactly the same. So it's not an added value. I don't know if you understand what I mean here. So the way I would like the Western people and Western Muslims, so to speak, to be involved is by getting this sense.
If I may specify my question a little bit.
That you mean that I didn't get it? Okay, that's fine.
Institutionally, do you do it as a Muslim individual within any kind of organization as long as it goes in the right direction? Or does it need to be done by Muslim organizations as such?
Okay, so this is a second stage in the question, and I would say it's not mutually exclusive. We need to have everything. In Western Muslims, I'm speaking about the three stages of the Muslim presence in the West.
It started with the nationality, and then with the Islamic reference, and then with the project. We need to have the three of them. We need Muslim organizations just starting and talking as Muslim organizations. We need to have organizations that are based on common ethics, and we go for that. We need to have, it depends on the topic, it depends on the project. But I wouldn't like people say, don't speak about Islam, and then they end up not willing to have, and this is why I think that this project, for example, American Muslim for Palestine, that's very important. This is one way of putting it, and we need other way. And we have, it's not because we are playing politics, because this is exactly it. This is exactly it. Sometimes you speak about to people as Muslim, and sometimes you speak as citizen, and sometimes you speak for the project itself. So it depends from where I'm talking. This is the exact way. So we have to be transparent as to the means, because we are clear as to the objective. And we have different means, because we are clear on the objective. But when you don't have an objective, your vision is not clear, you start hesitating as to the means. But I don't have a problem with people saying is that it's a Muslim organization, and so what? And if somebody is telling you, oh, in the name of the secular system, we don't need Muslim, I said, come, sit down. We need to define secularism, because it's not secularism that you are talking about. It's a specific understanding of anti-religious presence within the secular society, which is not secularism, it's your ideology. So we need to be constructive in this discussion. So, and the last point that what you were saying about this very deep question, I agree with Dr. Hatem. It would it's a long teaching, and then, the way I would put that is, in fact, there are two ways in the way we are talking about transdisciplinary approach, is just to connect, to show the interdependence of all the knowledge. And in fact, I would put it a bit differently, is the thing that we need to find everywhere, in every field, is also this discussion about the ego and the way you look at it, and the way you look at knowledge. Because knowledge is power, but it depends with whom and how. I think that this is essential for me, is just the way you look. So it's just don't forget your share in this life. That's what ahsan, and do what is good. These are understanding of how you are in this life, and then how you need to deal with a kind of being involved. But the detachment is being involved in everything that you ask is the goal. Before the way it deals with yourself is the goal. What are you doing? Why are you doing what you are doing? It's an education, which is a spiritual education in everything. This is why when the people are saying spirituality is about praying during the night, I would say it's not only this, it's praying during the night to know how you deal with things during the day. But praying during the night, it has a connection with also the way you are going to deal with things during the day. And this is also why we are fasting. So this is why I'm saying fasting is not only about the poor, it's a it's an education of the self. And then it's what are you ready to give. And this is a jihad in nafs. This is in fact the connection with Allah is this. When the people were saying, if the enemies are coming, we are going to fight. We are going to fight. We are going to fight. These were companions of the Prophet ﷺ. And came the verse. Why are you saying what you don't do? So meaning you talk a lot, but at the end, this is why you have to come to this. Not as guilty heart, but accountable of this. It's the sense of the sacrificing something, and you have to pay for that. You have to pay. I'm sorry, get it as it is. You want to play a role in the West, you are going to pay for it. You have to pay. Sometimes it's your job, sometimes it's your reputation, sometimes it's the perception that people have. But if you want to please the West, sit down. If you want, not only the West, by the way, even the Muslims, and even more within the community. This community is just, wow.
community. And I always keep repeating this to everybody. I'm coming from someone. All what I'm saying now, you know, I don't have quite merit. I was born with this. But I will never, never, never. That the one who was my grandfather, who was killed, he was 42. I'm now much older than him. He was 42. He was 42, and when he was 41, he was crying in the streets of Egypt. Because he had problem with this community, always talking, you do, you don't, you do, you don't. And he stopped my father, this is my grandfather. He stopped my father, and he told him, yes, if I was to work for this community, I would have stopped. But I work for him and we have to carry on. That's the starting point of the road. This is the way. If the people are asking me what I'm getting from this family is this. One was killed, he was 42, and the other one was in exile for 42 years. Okay, and he passed away. So what I got from this is, you have to pay. You have to pay. It's through suffering, it's through... And sometimes you will get this joy, but it doesn't mean that you play the victims. You have to pay means this is the way you are a subject. A subject always pay. This is the way you educate the self. Hello, this is my thing. This is a person. By the way, it's my own interpretation.
Thank you.
Yes. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yes, we are going to get, okay, go ahead and we'll take as much as we can, as many as we can. Go ahead.
2 questions. First question, I want an answer from each of you, if it's possible. Can a woman be a caliph? And if so, why so? And if not, why not? Second question.
That's the question.
Can a woman be a caliph?
Why not?
Second question.
Once you got your answer, that's fine.
Second question is going back to what I tried to get at yesterday. Once again today there were calls for creative ijtihad. And today Tariq, I feel, he recontextualized the need for ijtihad in terms of a tension between Islamists and secularists, and also between so the tension is between people who want to respect the tradition and people who want to forget it. But I feel that yesterday, with the characterization of some people as colonial leftists who may not regard the Quran as divine, this helped bring that very dynamic into the room. So I want to ask the question again with a bit more detail. If you want creative ijtihad, what's holding you back? Is it perhaps a legal positivist interpretation of Islamic jurisprudential history, or a liberal dehistoricizing of the Islamic jurisprudential tradition? I ask this question because I see the jurisprudential history as ijtihad, rather than a bureaucratic machine or a matrix of algorithms which we should construct to regulate human behavior. Because in Islamic history there were more than 4 canonized madhabs, there were many that lived and died. There was also ijtihad that existed outside of the madhabs altogether, and probably also outside of the canonized sects of Sunni and Shia. And of course we have to bear in mind that the science of hadith authentication emerged through the struggle between the Sunni and Shia at the very beginning. So, yeah, I mean, my basic question is, you know, do we recognize that there is a problem with legal positivism creating a kind of machine out of Islamic law, when really we should use it as a resource to inform us, but not to dictate us?
Okay. Hope I got that as well. What is the next?
My first point is to Dr. Shinqiti. You started off with a quote
today by Mohammed Iqbal about the Prophet having gone, on ascension and then coming back. And you made a very small comment saying that, those who wanted to stay there are just the mystics or the Sufis, and, they would be content with that. But I felt that kind of reduced and diminished, that entire movement. And so it's just feedback to you to maybe take into consideration, the history of the tariqas, which were actually involved in political change and transformation, and some still are today. And I'm not speaking obviously about the New Age Sufism Professor Tariq Ramadan speaks about. And also taking into account that as a historical phenomena, the kind of authority and sanctuary that it gave as a movement to women, for example, who were able to assert much more authority and not to romanticize it, through those channels. So I feel that we shouldn't be just reducing it in that way. And my second comment is about counter-power narratives, which Professor Tariq Ramadan spoke about. Coming from South Africa, in the apartheid era, we've seen the ulama aligning themselves with the apartheid regime, and the Muslim activists, obviously struggling against that regime. Both of them, using Islam or the interpretation of Islam, to go about that. And then in the post-apartheid context, again, the ulama aligning themselves with the post-apartheid ANC African National Congress, and the activists now, again, taking up the challenge in fighting corruption that has set in afterwards. So there's always this issue of self-interest versus the common good, because the self-interest for Muslims at the moment is to align themselves with the ANC, because we have religious freedom and they allow us to build mosques and etc., etc., halal food, and there's a list of things that Muslims want to tick off. But in terms of counterpower, what just happened in the current election is that a group of very senior members of the ANC had actually left the party now, and set up a movement to say enough, and calling people to align themselves with other smaller political parties and vote in that way so as to reduce the power of the ANC. And this is all in the name of what Dr. El-Shinqiti spoke about, checks and balances, or mudafa, for accountability and better transparency. So, and it has been successful in that, the ruling party has lost a significant percentage in the last election. So I think the counterpower suggestion is a really powerful one, and it's just some feedback.
Okay, thank you. 1, 2, go ahead.
My understanding is that there's no ijma about ijma, and if that is true, that would seem to imply that there can be no ijma about usul, no consensus about what constitutes foundations. So does that make possible the project for rethinking foundations, bearing in mind their commitment to the Quran as a divine text, Kalamullah, as was mentioned yesterday? So I guess the question is, can we reconfigure ulum al-din and usul al-fiqh and usul al-din through a new critical engagement, going all the way back to the final source, the Quran itself, in kind of picking up something that Nelson Maldonado Torres pointed to this morning, the distinction between the transformative and the revolutionary. Is that a valid project? And if not, why not?
I had a related question, but I had another one to speak about.
So you have 2 questions now.
Yes. So I'm going to ignore the related question. I wanted to ask about, it appeared that you would explain here, because we won't be here tomorrow, so I just wanted to kind of talk about what you said yesterday. It was talk about that there needs to be a new methodology of application of that which is existing. And do you not think that in order to apply something, in order to have a new methodology of application, we have to be able to decide what we're applying. And we, as Muslims, I think we have to accept the Quran and the Sunnah, and that is a fact. But the Sunnah and the Quran have been interpreted through the ages, right? And there is, we've talked about ijma there, whether there was ijma on the Sunnah. I think that I wanted to know if you think there needs to be a new application to new problems that have emerged, or rather we still need to re-look at the conceptual framework to consider the issues that were considered previously, i.e. it may be slavery, it may be women and various other issues, and re-look at them in the contemporary zone, as opposed to looking at new problems, say, which I think are at the periphery of Muslim concern. So, for example, biomedical ethics, I would argue, in some ways is at the periphery of Muslim concern. I would argue it's analogous to the liberal state in Western terms, talking about minor issues. Oh, maybe we can just kind of tinker a bit with environmental, maybe we can do some recycling or something. I think that is analogous to that in some ways, because it's, especially when we talk about future hypothetical problems, deep endemic problems like you talked about economics, you did, and there are other things that we need to relook at, I think, and I hope that we can relook at them together. So I just pose that to you. Maybe we can extend that which has already been worked on by the ulama in the past, and reconfigure it.
I'm coming to you.
In your talk, you spoke about the priority of freedom and autonomy, and I'm wondering if you can elaborate on your vision of the subject that exercises freedom and autonomy. How is that subject constituted? Is it based on an individualized, self-constituting self? And what's the relationship between that vision of subject and that pictorialized representation of gender on the poster over there, which seems to project a very essentialized binary vision of gender?
It seems to.
Project.
It seems to, or it's projecting?
It is projecting, in my interpretation. I was trying to exercise an interpretive humility.
So it seems to.
So, should we leave this here or think to go?
I'll wait until I hear your responses.
Okay. Yes.
My question is more in response to Dr. Shafi, but I would of course love to hear ideas. So your talk earlier was about the need for a transformative world order, and it was great, and I completely agree that Muslims need to challenge political, economic injustices that contradict Islamic values. My question is more one of practicality and application, similar to some of the ones that have come up. So as like a Western Muslim, as a Canadian, for example, I think shopping at Walmart or buying chocolates, bananas, clothing that's the product of slave labor, this is problematic and not in line with Islamic principles and not in line with what Dr. Ramadan was saying, sorry.
It's okay.
Dr. Ramadan said yesterday about changing the world for a better place. But this is where my question comes in. As a Muslim Canadian, I'm automatically legitimizing and reinforcing the system every day. Every day I go to school in a university that has bonds with unethical corporations, that has bonds with the apartheid state of Israel, that has bonds with everything. So, and that's just one small example. Like, just by existing in the system, I'm strengthening it. So my question would be, is it idealistic and naive to believe that a person can resist a system while participating in it and making it stronger? And what is more like what's more effective essentially, boycott from within or boycott from without? And if it is naive to believe that, then is there any alternative? Also, if it's okay, can you just let me know if they did end up building that football field? I'm really interested.
Yes.
I have two questions. I think hopefully they're short.
Can you speak?
Oh yes. Is this better? Can you hear me?
Yes, very good.
So I have two questions. I think hopefully they're quite short though. and I think they're both methodological questions that I'm trying to kind of make sense of. The first is for Sheikh El-Shinqiti, and it was in your slide of the 11 values, the 11 anti-pyramidical values. I guess the question I had was, and I apologize if there's a paper associated with the presentation. If there was, I hadn't read it, and maybe it was defined in there. How are those 11 kind of methodologically defined? Are they being taken from the Quran, and how are those 11 values chosen over other values? And I think secondly, and I think obviously I can't ask for a definition because there's not time for that, but in selecting a definition, how do we select a definition when we know, for example, these terms are defined very differently historically, whatever, if the term is freedom or justice. If we're taking textual sources, how do we select those sources where these terms are defined differently in the 2nd century versus the 10th century versus today? So kind of how do we actually go about doing that? And I think that, for me, the larger question, that's, I think, an example of the larger questions. I think I'm very interested and excited about this project of critical ijtihad that you're proposing, Dr. Ramadan. But I guess for me, I have a question about how that's actually implemented. How do we critically look at texts that have been written, the texts of fiqh, the texts of Sharia that have been written over the past 1,400 years that I think everybody, on the panels over this week and last week has said, at different moments have reflections of sexism, of racism, of all sorts of types of violence that we know. How do we look at those? Because we know we can't simply just extract those and cross those lines out of a book. So how do we actually engage with all of that tradition in a critical way, or to understand that and not just throw all of that stuff out? How do we actually read the text in a way that is informative to our lives today while recognizing the ideology that undergirds some of the things that we have a deep problem with?
Okay, thank you. I think it's... So who wants to start?
I'll start with the field first. So we have a major edifice right now. I mean, the university owes 430. The university owes 430 million right now because they built it. They promised they're going to sell seats for supposed audience, and they end up not selling enough. When the university was asked to invest in diversity, they allocated $1 million. And at the time that I was at the university, I said, why don't you consider the students to be the turf on the field so they would actually allocate more? Or consider part of our department, part of the athletic department, because the football coach actually was given a contract for $7 million. He has a shoe contract, a jacket contract. I said, make sure that he has an underwear contract. Because this is the priority at the university where you actually have all these aspects of the corporatization of the university and beginning to make the university as the revolving door of reproducing the system. Which raises the question that you said, can we engage at a time where we are replicating and enabling the system? And that's a very difficult ethical quandary that you are in. On the one hand, you can say, well, I'm not going to engage and stay at home. But even your home is built through a variety of different initiatives, and therefore you have to select strategically where you could deploy your energy to have some effectiveness in your sphere of influence. Now, during the anti-apartheid movement, we had a whole list of almost 2,000 corporations that we were asked to boycott. And at the university level, we actually selected Coca-Cola to boycott. Even though that its investment in South Africa from an investment perspective was very small, but it was the high contact that Coca-Cola had in college campuses that made the choice, the most effective choice for the strategy. And the second, there was another corporation that was ready to compete, which is Pepsi, that was not there. So we were able to mobilize the boycott on Coca-Cola, and then all of a sudden Pepsi started putting in their proposals to universities, that they're actually not in South Africa, they have a social responsibility clause. So the strategy, essentially, Pepsi became our advertiser for the anti-apartheid movement in the United States. So in our sphere of influence, we had to deploy our assets in order to make a very tangential effect that had a ripple effect in many corporations all of a sudden beginning to adopt our social responsibility clause on a national level, and all of a sudden 400 universities were kicking out Coca-Cola and beginning to have a social responsibility clause. So we have to be strategic in how we select where we're going to deploy our resources, because we're unable to remove ourselves completely from the world, but we are able to make these choices. And especially today, for me, we have the PDS movement for Palestine, boycott, divestment, and sanction. In whichever place you are, you have to select an appropriate target taking place. For example, now, both in Europe and the US, we're having a campaign, Have a Date with Justice. The Israeli date companies, they actually have many settlements that cultivate the dates from the occupied territories in a very, really oppressive way, and then they market it in Europe and the United States as Middle Eastern dates. So we want to make sure that as Muslims begin to engage in Ramadan, they take on the campaign of boycotting days. So it's a very targeted campaign. The effect on the Israeli economy might not be that large, but the symbolic effect and the ability to make the individual at the mosque and the local market level take a conscious decision to remove Israeli date from the shelf and bring an alternative, whether it's from North African dates, Iraqi dates, or US dates from California, that makes an important symbolic as well as effective strategy. So those strategies have to be deployed in a very specific way, and it does have a transformative effect. Now, it's a long, as Martin Luther King says, that the art of history is very long, but it tilts toward justice. So you need to always focus on that tilt and take deliberate steps for that change that you are trying to undertake. There's a number of questions, so let me go through some of those. And then the question about whether a woman can be a caliph, and you wanted the answer. My answer, from my perspective, I don't see anything in the tradition, even though there's some of the hadith that speaks there on مَا فَلَحَ قَوْمٌ وَلُّوا أَمْرَهُمْ إِمْرَأَ, that there is a nation that is led to success if they have given their affairs to a woman. That statement of the Prophet, one, it's an ahad hadith. It's a single chain transmission, meaning it does not give us قطع الدلالة, categorical judgment, but actually gives us dhanni, right? So as such, it's an ahad hadith. Second, it was in reference to an external community, not to the Muslim. So that which is external cannot be applied without any rigor to the Muslim community. So for me, that indication would not prohibit structurally for a woman to be in a position of the caliph. Second, I would say Muslim reality have already bypassed that question. We already have a Pakistani leader, we had a Turkish leader, we had an Indonesian leader that was elected by the people. So the populace already went ahead of the legal tradition in that question, which for me is an ijtihadi matter. It's not a revelatory issue. So ijtihadi matter is subject to interpretation, subject to discussion, for us to have that perspective and that aspect in there. Now, definitely this is not the majoritarian position. The majoritarian position is still hold that the woman cannot be a caliph. You have also individuals that will argue that a Muslim can't be a qadi, a judge, and they use certain aspects of a woman's particular physical conditions as a way to argue this point, and the evidence or the illah that they introduce really is not commensurate with the restrictions that are applied in there. So those are the questions that we have to deal with in a very specific way. Now this gets me into the issue of whether there is ijma' in usul or there is no ijma' about usul unless there is no usul, if there is no ijma' about. I think that logic of lack of ijma' does not necessarily negate the structure of usul, because you still have an agreement by a large number or segment of the scholarly community about a particular rendition. You don't have to have ijma' to actually accept the priority of evidences. And as such, what we do need is a creative ijtihad in understanding how we could reapproach these sources in a much more dynamic and, I would say, creative way. Historically, the Muslim scholars have been creative and dynamic, and I think later on we became almost, by the time you get, from my perspective, 17th, 18th century, maybe a little bit earlier, you get into a much more protective, isolative process and approach to Islamic law, and therefore creativity tends to put to the side and does not really engage in a very rigorous process. I am committed to engaging in a creative ijtihad, but not the ijtihad that is advocated by people like Irshad Manji or what you call all of these talking heads, which they don't have anything other than a head that's supposed to talk, where basically Muslims are the site of their experimentation of how to bring about a civilized, imitative, inferior other to Western norms. And I think what we have is to engage in an internal, rigorous, creative process to solve the issues that we're confronting as Muslims. Now let me add the following. Any Muslim that is engaging today with our traditional project, we need to understand that we are divided on a number of issues. Right? For example, and this is not coming from me, this is just coming from Rand Corporation classification. Okay? They talk about Salafi, Wahhabi, Ikhwani, Sufi, modernist, traditionalist, conservative, Shia, Sunni. They just highlight, and their strategy in civil democratic Islam is how we could bring about civil democratic Islam by getting all of these people to fight one another, with the hope that a modernist that emerges that represents our understanding, meaning from Rand Corporation, is what they're seeking. So we need to understand that the divisions that are there is an instrument for actually our continued lack of coherence among ourselves. We agree for the most part on 97%, give or take, but we take those 3% and we beat each other so much to almost to Judgment Day. And it's about time for us to wake up and smell the coffee, Yemeni coffee that is, not Starbucks, for us to understand that we need to change the dynamics that are there, that is present, in order for us to reach to a different cluster of arrangement for our Muslim community and that can engage in the world in a transformative way. As long as we are in this scope, we are not transforming anything other than basically allowing for the killing to continue and the destruction to continue. And we're about to enter a new era right now, if you are not watching the news in Iraq and Syria, where the Sunnis or Shia are going to kill each other while all the manufacturers of weapons are just going to be happy all the way to the bank. If that does not get you to at least understand what we are facing, then we should just be very clear of the project that is in front of us. It's a monumental project. A lot of lives are at stake for it.
Bismillah, can a woman be a caliph? Alhamdulillah, I got the answer from Dr. Hatem. I don't need to repeat it.
Cite me in Qatar for that.
Well, I just want to add that actually the solid foundation for this is the story of the Queen of Sheba in the Quran, Surah Saba. And I like the methodology of Mu'adh ibn Jabal, radiallahu anhu. You know, the story of Mu'adh, when Prophet ﷺ sent him to Yemen, and he has that beautiful dialogue with him, and he said, what you're going to do if you face a new problem? And he said, well, I will look in the book of Allah Azza wa Jalla for the answer. If I don't find it, I will look in the Sunnah of the Prophet. So in principle, I think, when you get answer in Quran, you don't need to worry whether there is a hadith that is against it or not. You can sleep tight that you get the answer from Quran. That's actually, this is what at least what I understand from Mu'adh. If you get the answer from Quran, be happy. If you don't get it, then you look in Sunnah. If you don't get it in Sunnah, then you try your best. So the story clearly in Quran is talking about this woman who's leading a nation in the way of success. and that's it enough to take that. There is the remark about Sufi and politics. Yeah, you're right. I need to qualify that statement, no doubt about it. My view of the statement. Some Sufis are isolated, disconnected from social life, public life. I say about this kind of Sufis that for them Islam did not get out of the cave of Hira in the first place. So the end for them is actually the beginning in Islam. It's just that initial stage of contemplation and isolation that Prophet ﷺ in the cave of Hira, they see that as the ideal, which is actually, it's not the ideal, that's the beginning, it's not the end. But there are some Sufis, no doubt, who have much more comprehensive understanding of Islam, and they know that Islam is much more than that. I think Islam can be summarized in 3 terms. All of them are derived from juhd, effort. One is mujahada. First is mujahada. The second is ijtihad. The third is jihad. So mujahada, that is what we call now tazkiyah, or working on oneself. Ijtihad, that's the intellectual part of Islam. And jihad, that's the social and public part of Islam. So Islam can be summarized in these. Of course, there are what we call in religious studies types of religiosity. Some people, by disposition and their personality, they tend to have their religious life individualistic. There is some what we call social religiosity, ritual religiosity, even reactionary religiosity. There are several types of religiosity. Part of it is just psychological difference between human beings. And we can't avoid that, but we need to try our best to cover Islam as a whole. لا إجماع حول الإجماع. Yeah, that's correct. There is no consensus that there is a consensus or there was a consensus ever. And there is no consensus that consensus is a source of legislation in Islam. Therefore, to me, I can't take it easy. We are required to follow the word of Allah, whether in form of Quran or Sunnah. Any kind of understanding of a human being of this is just understanding of a human being. Whether they agree or they disagree, after all, we try our best to follow the word of Allah. And also, part of ijma' or consensus is not based on a text in the first place, it's based on maslahah. It's just something to serve the interest of the community in a specific time and place, and therefore it's not a problem. More than that, and this is related to politics, I tend to take the opinion of Allal al-Fasi, who is one of the great scholars of Usul, who believes that ijma' actually was originally a political concept. It's not legal concept. Ijma', as the Prophet ﷺ talks about it in his hadith, is the political ijma'. Means if the majority of people take political decision, the minority need to respect that. That is now the decision of the community. Because if we don't do that, so there won't be any common life if we don't respect the opinion of the majority. So ijma' basically, originally, is just like alayka bisawad al-a'lam. It's about political majority. It's not a legal term, and transferring it to fiqh from politics is a part of this adaptation of Islamic political values, or marginalization, actually, of the Islamic political values. That's what Al-Albasi said, and I think it's accurate. The 11 values I talk about today are taken mainly from Quran, some from Sunnah. The concept of qist, justice, is in Quran, Surah Al-Hadid. Shura is in Surah Al-Shura. Mushawara, Surah Al-Imran. Ijma' is Surah Al-Nisa. Amana is in several surah, including Surah Saba, Surah Al-Ahzab. Al-Quwa is mentioned in Surah Al-Qasas, historic Musa alayhi salam in other surah. Al-Raddu ila Allah wa Rasul, this is in Surah Al-Nisa. Mudaba'a was mentioned 2 times, Surah Al-Baqarah, Surah Al-Hajj. Maybe there are 1 or 2 taken from Sunnah, like the term Malullah. This is used in the Hadith of Prophet for public wealth, or more accurately used by one of the companions of Prophet. He said, Prophet used to take the expenses of his family for 1 year out of the public wealth, and then he keeps the other as Malullah. Means he keeps the other as public, if there are booties of war or any kind of income or sadaqat or zakat coming from Bahrain, for example, some countries from Yemen. Prophet ﷺ, as a leader, he took the expense of his family for 1 year, and then he put the other in the its public property. That public property was described as Malullah. How do we define this term and give them the interpretation? Well, I just use the linguistic and intellectual term. I used to teach tafsir in Liman University in Yemen and Arabic grammar, and I use some techniques that scholars use. But very, very important here is the history of the term, because we need to understand the term in the meaning that it was used for the first time. I cannot use sayyara in Surah Yusuf, it means car, because sayyara in Surah Yusuf means caravan, there were no car. The Arab today have the right to call car sayyara, but I'm not going to interpret the word in Surah Yusuf as a car. I just have to go to the use of the word at the beginning. So the use of this term at the beginning has changed through time because of the political adaptation. And I think what I'm asking for is we need to go to the original meaning of this term. Thank you.
A small clarification. In terms of those 11 concepts, I know they're taken from the Quran, but how do you select those 11 versus any other concept out of the Quran? That's what I was asking.
Well, political thought in general, whether is taken from Quran, Sunnah, from any other source, is about power, it's about managing political power. And I found that these concepts are the closest to what is this management of power, whether it's political legitimacy, how you built this structure of leadership, and how this structure of leadership function, and what kind of relation is supposed to have with people. These are the 3 questions that we need to focus on when we are looking for these values or political values. Thanks.
So about the first question, because you wanted the answer of the 3 of us, I would say that even the fact that the hadith is had, and even from within the tradition, and as it is mentioned in Bukhari, there is also something which has to do with the transmitters. So meaning here that there was already a critical thinking about this when Abu Bakr is the one who transmitted this hadith, and there are questions about so even the level of authenticity. So meaning by this that anything which has to do with politics and even the commitment to some of the hadith is once again we come to what we said this morning, is about an ijtihad here. We are dealing with ijtihad so there is now no problem as to the principle. Now the way we are going to deal with it is something that it's open for so I don't have a problem with this, depending on the once again, the skills and the reality of the time, so no problem on this. The second is about what you said about the creative ijtihad and the legal tradition. I think that there might be a misunderstanding of what we are saying. 3 things. First, that in the vision of the center, and even in the way I'm trying to translate this, to be clear on the fact that we take the texts seriously. Meaning of Quran Kareem
This is one. Second is the critical thinking about all the science of ahadith. Of course, we are open to this and we are critical. As just I was saying about even the level of the way we are dealing with Al-Bukhari and Muslim and other ahadith, and this is at the highest level, meaning that there are al-mutawatir and there are ahadith that, you know, the categorization is there. Now being critical even in the way it was understood and why it was said, what are the reasons and how. This is all a question that is open to critical thinking. Now the second thing is about the legacy, meaning that to come back to the Turas, to come back to the Islamic tradition, doesn't mean that we are not critical. It's even very important to come to some scholars and to look at the way they were reading the scriptural sources from where they are, or where they were at that time. The context is very important. And this is where, for example, we need to have this. I don't think that you are going to be creative by negating the contribution of the past. I learn a lot by reading previous scholars. And even if I don't agree with some of the answers, I am getting the methodology, coming to get the understanding. And anyone who's today, for example, telling me about, you know, oh yes, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali is a great scholar, but Ibn Taymiyyah, I say, no, look, sit down and read. Because even in some of the positions of Ibn Taymiyyah, who is now misused by some Salafi, it's a very powerful mind. And the powerful mind of the past is helping me to be quite courageous and powerful today. And by the way, you know, he paid the price. So I would say that the tradition is also about this. It's the way you read the scholars and the way you understand that. And sometimes they are ahead of us in many of the way they were dealing. Even, you know, so to be critical with this doesn't mean that we are not critical with the answers and we come back to tradition and I really think that some of the answers are to be understood as a consequence of an ijtihad in a specific period of time in the way they were reading the text from where they are, and that's it. So now we have to come with new answers. So this is even encouraging us to come with new responses. But the tradition is telling you something. We are coming somewhere. We are coming from somewhere. And I'm linked to the Quran and the Sunnah also through this history. So I want to keep that. Because it's something which has to do with intellectual faithfulness is not to be faithful to the answers, it's to be faithful to the questions. And the way you deal with history and time. So I think that this is, this is shaping a mindset. It's shaping a mindset. And I'm very scared of some of our students. I'm not talking about you, by the way, because I understand your question, but I'm very scared by some minds that are educated in the West. The way they put the question is why they westernize in the way they are dealing with the tradition. Because they don't know about the tradition, and they think that being critical with the triple sources is the way you are facing the challenges of your time. But I would say you don't face the challenges of your time if you don't also try to be connected to something which is coming to the intellectual tradition you belong to. Yes, I belong to an intellectual tradition. It doesn't mean that I'm not going to be critical. It's because I'm critical that I know where I'm coming from. And there is a history here. So, and by the way, this year, even in the West, it's not always said that it's like this. Only we were just to, just look at somebody who was very challenging and all this discussion about the concept of justice and roles and all this. And this very deep philosophical tradition coming from Kant. And then you see, if you don't get this, you think you speak and you respond to roles. That's not true. You respond to a mindset, a historical way of dealing with things and truth and rationality. That sometimes behind even the way they put the question, there is sometimes intellectual arrogance that you don't get if you only deal with his answers and not his tradition. If I understand what I mean in this. So this is also, having some intellectuals in our history, the intellectual humility that you can find in the way they are dealing with the text is something which is important. And to tell you the truth, I prefer intellectual humility of the past than arrogance in the present.
That's also the way I look at this. So it doesn't mean, once again, that we agree with the answers. It's something which is deeper than that. In the way I would like to deal with the creative ijtihad. What you said about South Africa, I think, so acknowledging that the fact of counterpower is important. But out of your experience, and I think that this is everywhere, and especially now, in political ground, in economic ground, in all these, we have to acknowledge something now. And especially for Muslims living in the West, but not only. It was the case in South Africa, it's the case everywhere. Now we need to be clear on political terms. We are going to have to fight Muslims who can say La ilaha illallah, as you are saying La ilaha illallah, and being on in the political field exactly the opposite of what you are doing. And this is something which is, you know, to have this understanding that there is a Muslim consensus on politics and the way we do it. No, now we have in traditional political categorization, we have Muslims on the left and Muslims on the right, and people on far left and far right. There's going to be a struggle here that we need to get this, as in the political ground you have people supporting apartheid and people who are exactly being opposed to this. And what you experience is everywhere now in the West. And the starting point was even, you know, when I was talking to African American Muslims just before the election, before Bush, he said, look at these crazy immigrants, they are going to support Bush because of the Middle East, and we are for, they were for Grosfoguel at that time, I think. Al Gore. Okay, anyway. This is something. So, look, there is a misunderstanding in something that we were saying here. I not completely agree with Dr. El-Shinqiti in the fact that it's only political. I really think ijma is part of the legal tradition in Islam, and it was not only used like this. This is my take on that. Now, that there is no ijma on ijma or about ijma, that's fine. We don't have a problem with this as a secondary sources of the Islamic legislation. That this was criticized from within, that's fine. But we're not talking about this. We're talking about the fact that there is no ijma as a legal source. This is one thing. Now, about usul al-fiqh, and about the fact that there is something which is a science here, that there are different views on this. This has nothing to do with an ijma on a science. We're not talking about this.
Of course there is.
Sorry?
Of course there is, because the science emerges in a communal setting. And for the science
any science, and even in the way things were built on fiqh, on usul al-fiqh, there is something which is the mainstream Muslim and Shia and Sunni tradition are taking this as a science in itself. Now, from within, did you have people being critical towards usul al-fiqh? Yes, of course. Of course. And some were not happy with the categorization itself. And some were not. We were talking, for example, about Ashur, for example, in the way he was looking at this, saying we are missing the point, but still it helps in the way we are categorizing the fact that we are extracting the rules and getting the objectives. So there is a critical thinking within the sciences with any scientific field in Islam. With any, about the methodology and about but this has nothing to do with the fact that there is no ijma about ijma in the legal sense. These are two different questions. You are missing here or confusing two different things. Now, from within the usul fiqh, shall we be critical about usul fiqh and the way it was said and used? I would say yes. And this is exactly what I'm saying in radical reform. I came back to usul fiqh saying we have to question this, the way it has been used and the way it has been constructed. I think so. This is my position, but it's not new. There is no scoop here. It's just something which is.
Yeah, just so I understand correctly, it's not just the way it's used, but the way that it was constructed.
Of course, that's my position. Yeah.
I think the door is open for engaging in the door is open for engaging in Sharia. Must be a Palestinian, the one side. I'm used to it. The door is open for engaging in creative Sharia to construct a new usul. But in constructing a new usul, you have to entangle and engage the existing usuls. And that project itself is a monumental project. And as such, so far, up to this point, we contend with the usul that is there. So the door is open to construct usul if you can engage in a complete, unrestrained ijtihad to do it, ijtihad mutlaq. But your starting point is to look at what exists and to construct an alternative. But you cannot construct an alternative and say, well, I don't like this without actually contending with it. And what I see often is like, oh, this is not working, and I'm going to construct my own. That for me, even in any scholarship, is just an unstarting point. Like, think of somebody coming with a PhD thesis and not having footnotes of any work before them and saying, that's my creative ijtihad, E equals MC squared. I tell them, well, you know, you're a little bit late. So in a similar way, we have to be rigorous in the methodology of constructing a new usul if that's our start or our methods toward answering the pressing questions.
Just on this, because I haven't finished the question, but go ahead.
Sorry, no. I mean, just clear that there is no ijma between me and my boss about ijma, so I will say that as a disclaimer. No, but I want to say something just about, of course, this dealing with tradition, sometimes you have to be hard on your past in order to save your future. And I think really that's what Muslims need today. We are protecting, or we are taking this tradition as a shield between us and the rest of humanity, between us and the future. And I really, so maybe I'm a more traditionalist person here in terms of education. I got my Islamic education on the back of camels in the desert of Mauritania. So, well, I ate some pizza later in Texas, but still that initial formation or training is very important. But I think we really need to be hard with our tradition, with our past, in order to move to the future. One of my favorite professors used to say, in order to build a new future, you have to build a new past. So we need to build a new past. We need to read and reread this tradition, including Ijma. Thank you.
Just to end with this, I don't know. I also, it was not on camels, but it was the one-to-one, very traditional way of getting the ijazat with scholars. Were very traditional. But I really think that we're reading the past means also that we have quite serious about the fact that there is something here. And I mean between the two is just what was said is as much as we need to know what was or what is the very framework of usul al-fiqh and the traditional usul al-fiqh. We're not going to be able to be critical. And ijma is part of this. So for example, in many of the people didn't get what I was putting in radical reform, which is a deep critique of usul al-fiqh as it was. And the third thing is about al-masadir, is that what are the sources of Islamic legislation? And I was saying that one of the main problems that we have is the relationship to the universe and the context, which for me is the starting point of the way we read the scriptural sources. So this is what it is. It is from the source asking the question about the way it's structured. And that's to say that I agree. You start from somewhere and you start being critical, but just to have just this critical position in principle doesn't help to move on. So I would say that this is my answer, but I'm not saying only the use of it. I'm saying the very essence, the very way we deal with it, and this is at least part of 3 chapters in the book Radical Reform. So very quickly, the last 2 things, because you were asking about the subject and freedom. I responded to I don't have time to come to a deep definition of the way I deal with freedom, but I was in fact talking about freedom and the notion of autonomy as subject. And as subject for me, we have to reconcile the Muslim intelligence and intellect with this, which is the very essence of كلهم آتيه يوم القيامة فردا. That one day you are going to be alone and you are accountable. Meaning that your dignity is based on your freedom and your way of deciding for yourself, for men and women. Now, what is, for me, an understanding of the Islamic tradition is that it's based on two things. In all the discussion that we have, there is something which is a difference between men and women in essence and biology. And there is a social construct. So it's both. But to deny the fact that there are differences, I would say, is wrong from my understanding of the Islamic tradition. To deny the fact that there is a social construct that is coming from somewhere is wrong. Now, if you end up saying that because we are using symbols, we are reducing everything, I have a problem with this mindset. I really think that if your critique is about the symbols, and only the symbols, not understanding what we are talking about, and saying, it means that you have this understanding, I think that this is where I would say there is a disconnect between the understanding of the deep discussion that we need from an Islamic perspective and some of the very mainstream discourses that we have from feminism in the West that are for me problematic. I'm advocating something which is a liberation process for women within the tradition and beyond the tradition. But I'm not going to reduce all what I'm doing on let us talk about are these symbols expressing the essence of what you think is a man and a woman or the social construct. I think it's in between. We have the two dimensions in Islam. That women are not men, and then in the historical process, how do we come to a deep discourse on women as subject is also something which is important. But this is where I would say I see the Islamic contribution to the Western discourse. I'm not going to compromise on this with the Western discourse now, because I think it's undermining the very essence of what I see. I see something which is the essence also of the revelation. So if now we go as far as to deny this is why I think that we are reaching some limits in the critical discourse. So the second step in the discussion that I have with you is, what are the limits of what you want to do? That would be my question to you, but this is not now. No, not now, but we can have a critical discussion on that. And I think that that's it. Yes, you were.
Just one comment, or two comments maybe. The first one is just to show that there is critical changes within CILE, so I want to have a critical remark on the and just to say that...
Are you guys going to go back on the same plane?
So just to say that, of course, there is ijma' on ijma', and I think there is ijma' on this. So I mean that there is ijma' on ijma', and if you look at all the books of usul, and all the madahib, and all the tayarat usuliyah, you don't find one single scholar saying that ijma' is not adillat al-tashri'a. They say adillat al-tashri'a al-muttafaq alayha hiya al-Qur'an wa sunnah wal-ijma'. The problem is not that there is not consensus on ijma'. The problem is that there is divergence on what is ijma'. There is the problem. So there is the lack of ijma' on the nature of ijma'. For example, Imam Ahmed bin Mohammed says, "Man idda'a al-ijma' faqad kadhab." So, and he is saying that ijma' is a source or adillat al-tashri'. But the problem here is, what is the scope of ijma'? I mean, is there ijma' possible on something where there is no text that is qat'i dalala, qat'i thubut? Okay, so there is a divergence on the nature of ijma', but there is no divergence on the fact that ijma' is one of the adillah. I'm gonna blind Second point is about usul al-fiqh and about the need to reform usul al-fiqh. I agree, but I think the problem is not in the usul al-fiqh that we inherited. I mean, can you give me one example of one
hukm that is wrong and that the fact that it's wrong is due to the usul, I don't think there is an example. I think the problem in usul is not that the usul that we inherited is wrong and it's leading us to wrong conclusions. This is not the problem. The problem is that the usul we inherited doesn't allow us to have creative ijtihad because they didn't give us the tools. The tools are not there to come to creative ijtihad. And we have also not, the tools were not developed in the traditional usul fiqh to do tahqiq al-manat in a proper way. So I think the problem is here, the historical problem of al-ahkam is the problem of al-isqat. That means that I do isqat on a text according to what I have in my mind and to my social, to the social influences. So if I say that a woman, for example, has a status beneath the man, this is not because the usul is wrong, but because there is a social reality that I impose on the text. And now the danger is to do isqat with the reality of today. So if you want to criticize the legacy, you have to criticize also today's reality and not to impose the legacy on the text, but not to impose also today's reality on the text.
Okay, as you can see, lots of discussions within the vision, and thank you for that. But we don't have time. Now the people are coming for the public lecture, and the public lecture is has started 1 minute ago. So you have. I think that we'll start at 6:45 so you can just. But be careful, people are entering. So if you leave your you might not find one. So we'll start at 6:45. What is that?